Hi, and welcome back to part 2 of month 10 of the Nebula block of the month sew along. We had so much great content for you that we broke it into 2 videos. So here in part 2, we are going to work on sewing our blocks together into a wedge and then sewing our wedges together into a quilt top. Let's get started. Quilt top is going to be made in 6 wedges, if you think of it as like a pizza pie. So this is the top left section of the quilt that I'm working on, which happens to be king size. If you're working on a queen, yours will be similar, just won't have these top blocks, and yours will have a little bit less width here. If you're working on the lap, this is what yours is going to look like, and we'll get back to that in a little bit. So we're going to work on putting this together in rows, and then we're going to sew those rows together. So the first step is to choose 2 blocks and head on over to the sewing machine. So I want to work on sewing these 2 together, and I'm going to pin them, and I want to make sure that I don't lose my points. So in this case, I'm going to flip this one onto this one, and then I think I'm actually going to sew it with the purple one up because the purple one has more points. So I'm going to flip it like this, and I'm going to go ahead and align my notched corners if your blocks have them, and you can cut them if your blocks don't. And I'm going to put a pin at each edge, and some blocks will have things that are going to line up and some don't. So if your blocks do, obviously you can line those up. If they don't worry about it so much. And again, we're going to be using the same scant 1/4 inch seam that we've been using for the entire project, and I'm still using the same gray thread as well. And this is where a stiletto will definitely be extra helpful. I want to keep these as lined up as possible. We're going to go slow when we go over seams. And here, since these do match up, I'm going to try and keep them on top of each other, either with my stiletto or a pin. I see that I have a point there, so I want to do my best to keep everything lined up so I don't lose that point that I worked so hard to piece in my block. Make sure I line up right on that point there as well. And sew to the end of my block. And now I'm going to go ahead and take my next 2 blocks and sew them together. And one question that has come up is, what do I do if my blocks are not the right size? So if this block is not the right size, instinct is to trim them. That's what we do with many quilts, but that's not what works best with my patterns because things are designed to be a puzzle here and fit together perfectly. So if this is a 1/4 inch or less off, you should be fine to be able to ease it in when you put your quilt together. If it's larger than that, you can consider trimming, but I would lay everything out on the design wall first before making that decision. If it's too small, best bet is probably going to be to remake that block. So let's go ahead and put these 2 blocks together. And I'll show you what it looks like if I don't pin. So I'm going to line this one up right on here. I have a lot of seams with this one, so I just want to make sure that I use my stiletto so that they don't flip up. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue sewing my blocks together into rows. Now that I have all of my rows sewn together, I'm going to go ahead and press the seams. Friendly reminder, pressing is up and down, ironing is back and forth. We want to press. We do not want to iron. We have a lot of bias that we do not want to stretch. up and down with a slight little wiggle. We now have all of our rows assembled, and we are now going to sew our rows together to complete this wedge of the quilt top. And this is where I find that specifically this seam more than any other is where you want to pay attention to make sure that gets lined up, because that's where your eye is going to go, to the outside of the starburst. So I'm going to be extra careful to make sure I line up that seam. There's a lot more flexibility in the rest of your seams. So let's start by putting these two rows together. So this is the seam and the area that we want to make sure that we line up. So I suggest you do a hang pin here. So quick hang pin refresher. So we're going to go down where these pieces intersect up here. And then we're going to take that same pin and we're going to go into this intersection here. And we're going to let it hang. So we're going to keep that pin. We're going to make sure it doesn't angle like this or like this. We're going to keep that pin straight like this. Then we're going to take two other pins and we're going to put them in either side while we keep that hang pin in there as our anchor. Then we're going to take that out. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew just here and then take it out from my machine, check it, because the last thing I want to do is sew the entire length of the seam, find out that this somehow was off and have to redo the entire seam. So I just want to sew this area, make sure that it's right, and then I can sew the entire seam. So I'm just going to start about an inch above. And if you want, you can do this with a longer stitch length so that it's easier to take out if you need to, and think of it kind of more as basting than stitching, because you will repeat sewing over this area in a minute or two when you go ahead and sew the entire length of your piece. So I'm going to take those pins out, snip my leader ender off, and let's open that up and see how it looks. And it looks pretty good. I am happy with that. So I am now going to go ahead and sew the entire length of this seam to sew these two rows together. So I'm going to line up my notched corner there. And if I have things that line up, just like when I was sewing my rows together, I'm going to work to keep those lined up and use my stiletto. Make sure I don't flip seams. And slow and steady is my advice here. There's no award for being the fastest to get your rows sewn together, assemble your wedges. You'd rather do it correctly one time than have to take it apart. So now I'm getting to where I've already sewn, so I want to make sure I sew right back onto that same line. And now I know that my points are going to be perfect. I'm going to continue sewing the rest of the piece. And since I know this is the outside edge of my quilt and I won't be adding any borders, I'm going to go ahead and backstitch to secure that. So I now have my bottom 2 rows. I'm going to go ahead and add my next row and continue till I have all of my rows added and my wedge complete. And now that I have all of those seams sewn, it is time to press them to have a completed section of my quilt. Now completed the first wedge for my king size quilt. So I'm going to follow the rest of the pattern directions to put together the other 5 wedges. And I'm also going to show you how we put together the wedge for the lap size quilt. This is the lap size Nebula that I've been working on. And we're going to go ahead and put together one of the wedges. So we're simply going to start with this extra triangle and first attach it to a background block. Go ahead and line that up, and since it's so small, I'm not going to worry about pinning it. I'm just going to sew my scant 1/4 inch seam, and I am going to back stitch at the end here since I know that's the outside of my quilt. Okay, now I'm going to grab this block and this one. So this is also assembled in rows. It's just kind of diagonal rows, mix of rows and columns. But I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna sew this block to this block. And since I wanna make sure I don't lose this point, I'm going to sew with my pink block on top. So I'm gonna lay them together. And in this case, I don't have a notched corner here. So I might cut that to help with alignment. Depends on your preference. I'm going to go ahead and line up here. And then this point is going to line up with this here. So I'm going to match those diagonals. Place a pin here. Then this happens to line up here. This will work with some blocks, not with all of them. So I'm going to line that up. And I think that's enough. I don't think that I need to trim that off, but if that would help you, go ahead and trim that off. I'm going to remove my pins as I go. You never want to sew over your pins. And again, this is where a stiletto can be helpful to make sure that don't flip any of those seams. I'm going to follow the same steps to go ahead and sew my last row. Now that I have all of my rows assembled, I'm going to go ahead and press them. Now that I have my rows assembled, I'm going to go ahead and put them together to finish my wedge. As you can see, this is very similar to the process we did with the king, just less pieces for the smaller lap size. So I have my triangle here on top of my next row. And again, I want to sew with the pink on top so that I make sure that I don't lose any of my points. So I'm going to flip that over, put some pins in place. Basically anywhere that I can line up seams or want to make sure that I have things together. This is where you don't want to rush because you want to make sure that this ends up as accurate as possible to show off all the great piecing you have done. So I'm just going to go ahead and sew my 1/4 inch seam. Now that I have that sewn, I'm going to go ahead and add my last piece. And just as I focused on this intersection when I was working on my king size, I want to focus on it in this one as well. So I am going to show you at the machine how I'm going to make sure that this is going to line up as best as possible. So here is that intersection that I want to focus on. And I want to make sure that this point, which is where these blocks are going to come together, and that line up as best as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and do a hang pin. In case you need, I'll do one more refresher. We're going to go in right here where those points meet, and then we're going to go back through where those points meet. I'm going to sandwich these together. I'm going to keep that pin straight. We want to make sure it doesn't angle up or down or right or left. I'm going to keep that pin straight so that if you look at it from this direction, it forms a T with the fabric. So then we're going to go ahead and take 2 pins and put one on the right and one on the left of that hang pin. I'm going to go ahead and sew just this small section just to confirm that my alignment is correct, because if it's not, it's much easier to take out a few inches of sewing than it is to take out the entire length of my piece. So I'm going to go nice and slow and sew right where that point is. And let's check and see if I'm happy with how that turned out. Let's open that up. And it came out okay. I'm happier with how my king one came out, to be honest. It looks like this one slid a little bit, but it is close enough for me, and since these are the same fabric, I'm happy enough. If you're not, though, it would be easy enough to take that out and redo that one small section. Now I'm going to sew the entire length of the piece. And that sewing that I just did is basically acting like a pin to keep that point lined up so that it doesn't slip. Now that I have this wedge assembled, I'm going to go ahead and press it. I've now finished putting this wedge together, and I have all 6 wedges for my lap size ready to go. And I'm going to show you how we assemble the quilt top using this lap as an example. The same techniques that we're going to use here are going to work whether you're doing the king or the queen or the lap. We're going to start with this left wedge and our center wedge, and we're going to sew the 2 of them together. And when we sew the 2 of these together, similar to how when we were assembling the wedge, we are going to focus on where we are going to see most, which is going to be right here and right here, these 2 spots. So I'm going to go ahead and do my stitching in just those 2 areas and check those points and see if I'm happy with them. I'm going to go ahead and do my sewing of these 2 points. I've chosen not to pin them. We'll see if that comes back to bite me or not. So I'm going to go ahead and get that lined up. Okay. And I'm going to do the same thing for this intersection, and then I'm going to check them both and see if I am happy or not. See if I regret my choice of not pinning. This is how I actually work a lot of the times. I just kind of wing it and go for it. I'm pretty confident in my ability to match things, but it doesn't always work. So we'll see. So let's open this up and check those points. That one's pretty good, especially for not pinning. I am happy with that. I'm not going to take that out, and that one's pretty good as well. So I'm going to go ahead now and sew the entire length of this piece, basically using those 2 areas as pinning. I'm not going to add any other pins, and I am going to backstitch at the beginning since this is the outside of my quilt now. I'm going to sew the length of this seam. Now I have the 2 wedges together, and I'm going to go ahead and press the length of the seam. Now I have these 2 together, and the next step is to add my top right. And again, I'm going to focus on this point and this point. And I'm going to show you at the machine one of the reasons why I don't often pin the length of this seam. Now you do what's best for you, but I'm going to show you why I don't pin so that if it helps you out, you have another option. Okay, so I'm going to sew the entire length of this seam without pinning, but I am first going to start again with the 2 points that are most important to me to make sure that I get things lined up where I want them in those 2 places. So this is where you could use a hang pin if that technique is helpful to you. I'm just going to go ahead and line mine up. Oh, and this is the first time not actually happy with that one. It's off a little bit too much, so I think I'm going to take that one out and redo it. But I am happy with this one. So 1 out of 2. Don't always win them all. So I'm going to quickly take this one out and redo it. Now I'm happy this time with how my points lined up. And I know it can be frustrating to sew and have to take things apart with a seam ripper and redo them, but it is much easier to have to redo just that small section rather than the length of the entire piece. So that is why I highly suggest doing this, and I always do it when I am putting things together like this. Now I'm going to go ahead and sew the length of the seam. I don't use pins when sewing long seams like this because I find that there are going to be places where things don't line up perfectly, and I like to ease them in rather than trim or redo things. And I find that I can give a little pull to the top or the bottom best without having it pinned so that I can ease things together. Some people prefer to pin and do their easing with the pins, whichever method works best for you. So what I do is I will usually sew from point to point. So I sew to that intersection, and then I sew to that one, and then I stop, and then I sew to the next one. And that's how I progress down the length of this seam. So when we get to the blocks, you'll see. So even here, you can tell there's like a little bit of a bubble because this is a bias piece cut here, and that's a straight grain down there. So I'll just give a little bit of a tug to get those flat together. And now I've reached where I already sewed my points. I'm just going to slowly go right back over my stitching. And what I'm going to do here is some blocks are going to have points that match up, which this one happens to. Not all blocks do. And I'm going to do my best to make them match up along the way. And instead of having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pins, I'm just going to ease in as I go. So I'm going to line those up. And like I said, give it a little pull. And when I say a little, you're not using much strength here. Just a little pull to flatten that out. And don't get your finger too close. This is where a stiletto can be helpful. And then here, this piece up here is too short, and this piece is a little too long, which makes sense because this is straight grain, this is bias, so that piece must have gotten pulled a little bit. So I want to try and pull this piece to even them out. So I'm going to line them up perfectly and try and spread the bubble out on the bottom so that it will sew as flat as possible. Because even if your blocks are perfect or almost perfect, there's always something that's going to be a tiny bit off here, there, and there are ways to make it so that you minimize those things and you see as many points and beautiful blocks as possible. So I'm going to continue doing this till I get to the end of this seam. Now that I have my top half of my quilt together, I'm going to repeat those steps to put the bottom half together. I now have my quilt in 2 halves, and for the purpose of putting it up on my design wall, it's sideways. So this is the top half and that is the bottom half. It was just easier to get it up on the design wall to show you this way. And now we have 1 long seam to sew. But it's very important that we pay attention to our points here because they're going to be super visible. So this is our number one point that we're going to do a hang pin, and we're going to make sure that those 6 diamonds all meet up perfectly, because that is where your eye is going to go, and you've spent so long piecing your beautiful blocks that you don't want to, you know, in your race to get to the finish line now, take any shortcuts in this seam. So we're actually going to do multiple hang pins. We're going to do a hang pin here, here, and here. And then we are also going to do one here and here. So in 5 locations, okay? So where our blocks meet up, 1, 2, our center is 3, 4, and 5. And once we know that we have all 5 of those perfectly matched up, then and only then will we sew the entire length of the piece. So I'm going to show you our hang pin in the center one, and then I'm going to sew the whole piece together after I get all 5 hang pins in. Okay, so we got a lot of bulk to work with here now, so just kind of push it out of the way as needed. But we are going to do our hang pin for our center intersection here. And I've got a couple loose threads hanging from piecing the long seams, and I don't usually trim those off, but I'm going to do it in this case just so that they don't get in our way of me showing you what we need to do. So we're going to do our hang pin from that point to that point. I'll show it to you one more time. And then we're going to do a total of 5 of them along the seam. This center one, and then our 4 other block intersections. So we're going to go right in where our seam is there, and right in where our seam is there. We're going to sandwich these together, and we're going to let that pin hang in there. And then we're going to go place a pin on either side. Now I'm going to go ahead and sew this. Make sure that my points line up just perfectly, or as perfect as we can get them, because after all the time I've spent piecing these blocks in the background, the last thing I want is for the center to be off. So nice and slow, use your stiletto, keep everything out of the way, and sew right to where those points are. And stop. Get our pins out of the way. And we're going to open this up and check it. And as luck would have it, we're off by a tiny bit. For some of you, that might be good. But for me, that's the center of my quilt. I want it perfect, so I'm going to take the time to take this out and redo it. I redid my center point, and I am much happier with it now. So I'm going to go ahead and do my hang pin for my other 4 points, and then sew the length of my seam to finish my quilt top. All right, we did it. Sewed the last seam, so I now have a quilt top. There's always something so satisfying about sewing that last seam to finish quilt tops. Now I got to go ahead and press that and see what it looks like. Now completed putting my lap size quilt top together, and I am so happy with it. It's the first lap size of Nebula that I have finished, and next step is to send it off to be quilted. So I'll be back here next month to go over finishing your quilt.